The shovel bit into frozen earth for the 100th time that morning. Theron Birch stood chest-deep in a hole he had been carving for 6 days straight, and he knew with absolute certainty that every neighbor within 5 miles believed he was digging a grave for his own family. His hands were raw. The blisters had come on the second day, swelled on the third, and torn open on the fourth. Now they simply bled slow and steady, mixing with the clay and grit that coated everything he touched. He had lost 12 pounds since beginning this project. His shirt hung loose on a frame that had once been solid and compact, the frame of a man who had spent 5 years building furniture in a Cincinnati factory and 2 years breaking prairie sod in the Dakota Territory. It was October of 1872. The earth was still soft enough to work, but frost crept earlier each morning, painting the grass white before dawn and retreating only when the sun climbed high enough to burn it away. Theron knew he had perhaps 3 weeks before the ground froze solid. 3 weeks to finish what he had started. 3 weeks to complete the structure that would either save his family or prove every one of his neighbors right. The hole was 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide, and growing deeper with every swing. He was cutting into the southern face of a low hillside 3 miles west of what would eventually become the town of Hutchinson. The slope rose gently behind him, maybe 15 feet over a distance of 40, and the soil was a mix of clay and sand packed hard by centuries of prairie wind and buffalo herds. Beneath it, at a depth of about 10 feet, a natural shelf of limestone provided a foundation that no man could have laid better. Theron had chosen this spot with the care of a surgeon selecting where to cut. Southern exposure for warmth and light. Good drainage so water would run away from the structure rather than pooling inside it. Soil composition that was stable enough to hold its shape but workable enough for a man with a shovel and determination to move. He had plenty of determination. What he lacked was a single person who believed in what he was doing. From the ridge above, a rider appeared against the October sky. Theron heard the horse before he saw it, the soft rhythm of hooves on grass, the creak of leather, the snort of an animal picking its way down a slope. He did not stop digging. He knew who it was before the man spoke. Josiah Trask sat tall in his saddle, watching from the lip of the excavation with an expression that mixed genuine curiosity with something close to pity. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a weathered face and hands that knew their way around an axe and a plow. He had built his own cabin 2 miles east, a proper structure of hewn logs with a peaked roof and a stone chimney that drew smoke clean and straight into the sky. It had taken him and his 2 sons 12 days to complete. It was warm and dry and looked exactly like a home should look. What Theron was creating looked like a mine shaft. Josiah dismounted and walked to the edge of the hole. He stood there for a long moment, thumbs hooked in his belt, studying the raw earth walls and the methodical cuts Theron had made into the hillside. "Birch," he said finally, "what in God's name are you building?" Theron paused and leaned on his shovel. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered, with a dark, full beard and eyes that held the focused intensity of a man who had seen something others had not yet witnessed. He looked up at Josiah, standing clean and comfortable above him, and he felt the distance between them in more ways than the 8 feet of earth that separated their eye lines. "A home," he said simply. Josiah peered down into the excavation again, as if the word might change what he was seeing. It did not. "This is a hole," Josiah said. "A home sits above ground where decent people can see it." "A home keeps a family alive through winter," Theron replied. "What sits above ground does not matter if what matters is what keeps them warm." Josiah shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a horse that refuses to drink. "You are digging your family's grave, Birch. Mark my words. You will bury your wife and children in this hole come spring, frozen solid, because you were too stubborn to build a proper cabin." Theron returned to his digging without responding. He had heard variations of this prediction from every neighbor who had passed by in the last week. Deacon Hollis had suggested in his careful pastoral way that Theron might be suffering from mental strain. Ephraim Greer, who was the kindest man in the territory, had offered to help him build a real cabin before winter arrived. Even Margaret, who trusted Theron more than she trusted anyone on earth, had asked quietly one evening whether he was certain about all of this. But Theron was certain. He was certain because he had seen what traditional cabins could not do. He had felt what happened when winter came to the Dakota Territory with its full frozen fury. And he carried in his mind the knowledge given to him by a man who understood things that frontier settlers had forgotten or never learned at all. He kept digging. The winter of 1871 had nearly killed them. Theron remembered every detail with the kind of clarity that only comes from trauma, the kind of memory that does not fade or soften with time, but stays sharp and cold, ready to cut whenever the mind returns to it. They had arrived in the Dakota Territory in September of that year, full of hope and the particular brand of determination that drives people to leave everything familiar and stake their futures on land they have never seen. Theron had purchased 80 acres of prairie from the territorial office site unseen, paying with money he had saved over 5 years of 10-hour days in the furniture factory in Cincinnati. 5 years of cutting dovetail joints and sanding walnut until his fingers went numb. 5 years of breathing sawdust and dreaming of open land. The land was good. A creek ran through the eastern section, clear and cold, with enough timber along its banks to build a cabin and still leave trees standing. The soil was dark and rich, the kind that made a farmer's heart beat faster just looking at it. Theron had stood on a low rise that first afternoon, Margaret beside him, the children running through grass that reached their shoulders, and he had felt something he had never felt before. This was theirs. This was home. He built the cabin in 18 days, working alone from first light to dark, while Margaret and the children lived in the wagon that had carried them west. He followed the methods his father had taught him in Pennsylvania, methods that had served the Birch family for 2 generations and had never been questioned. Cut logs from the cottonwoods along the creek, notch them at the corners, stack them into walls, chink the gaps with mud mixed with prairie grass, build a door from split planks and hang it on leather hinges, construct a roof from smaller poles covered with thick sod. The cabin measured 14 feet by 16 with a stone fireplace at one end and a single window covered with oiled paper that let in a milky, diffused light. Theron built a sleeping platform along one wall, a table and 2 benches for meals, and a set of shelves for Margaret's kitchen things. He stepped back and looked at what he had made and felt pride settle in his chest like a warm stone. It was adequate for autumn. The days were cool but comfortable. Rain drummed on the sod roof and mostly stayed outside. Wind blew across the prairie and the cabin walls held firm. The children had room to sleep and Margaret had a proper hearth for cooking, and the place felt like what it was supposed to be. Then December arrived. It came not gradually but suddenly, as if someone had opened a door between the world they knew and some frozen hell that existed beyond the edge of every map. The temperature did not simply drop. It plunged. It fell through zero and kept falling past 10 below, past 20, settling at 30 degrees below zero, and staying there for days at a time. And the cabin that Theron had built with his own hands using methods handed down through generations revealed every one of its fatal flaws. The chinking between the logs, which had seemed tight and solid in autumn, dried and cracked in the extreme cold. Gaps appeared, small at first, barely visible. But the wind found them the way water finds cracks in a dam, with patient and relentless certainty. Cold air poured through those gaps in thin streams that could be felt from across the room. Theron patched them with fresh mud, but the mud froze before it could set cracking and falling away within hours. The sod roof, which had seemed thick and insulating, became a chimney in reverse. Heat from the fireplace rose to the ceiling and passed through the sod and into the sky, while cold pressed down from above like a hand pushing them toward the floor. The cabin became a place where warmth existed only within arm's reach of the fire. Beyond that radius, the air was bitter and hostile. And the fireplace itself, which Theron had built without proper understanding of draft and heat reflection, consumed firewood at a rate that defied his careful calculations. He had cut and stacked enough wood to last until March. He was certain of this. He had counted the logs, estimated the burn rate, added a margin for bad weather. By every measure, he knew the woodpile was sufficient. It was gone by the middle of January. The realization came slowly then, all at once. Theron would feed logs into the fireplace, and the fire would devour them and demand more. He would add larger pieces, and the flames would eat those too, producing heat that was fierce at the hearth, but seemed to vanish before it reached the far wall of the cabin. The fire was fighting the cold, and the cold was winning, and the only weapon Theron had was more wood. He spent his days outside in temperatures that froze exposed skin in minutes. He hauled dead timber from along the creek, dragging it through snow that was knee-deep in the open and waist-deep in the hollows. He cut it into burnable lengths with an axe that he had to warm by the fire before using, because the steel became brittle in the cold. He stacked it inside the cabin, filling every corner that was not occupied by his family, and fed it into the fireplace that consumed everything he brought and still wanted more. Margaret watched him leave each morning with fear she could not hide. Every time that door opened, the cold rushed in like a living thing, filling the cabin in seconds, erasing whatever warmth they had managed to build. And every time Theron returned, he was more exhausted, more depleted, moving with the heavy slowness of a man pushing beyond his limits. She never complained. Not once. She kept the children near the fire, told them stories, mended clothes, cooked whatever simple meals their supplies allowed. She was 29 years old, raised in a German farming community in Wisconsin, where houses were solid structures with windows that let in abundant light and rooms that felt spacious and clean. Her family had not been wealthy, but their home had been warm. Their home had been safe. She had left that world to follow Theron West because she believed in him, and she still believed in him, but belief does not stop the cold. It was the 23rd of January when Silas started coughing. At first it was nothing, a dry bark that came and went, the kind of cough that children get and shake off in a day or two. Margaret gave him warm water and kept him wrapped in blankets near the fire and thought little of it. Children cough, it is what they do. But the cough did not stop. It deepened through the day, becoming wet and heavy, rattling in the boy's chest like something loose and broken. By evening, Silas was hot to the touch. His forehead burned under Margaret's palm. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, and his breathing had taken on a ragged quality that made both parents go still when they heard it. The fever came on fast and hard. By midnight, Silas was shaking beneath every blanket they owned, his small body generating heat that seemed impossible for a 9-year-old frame to produce, while simultaneously shivering as if the cold had gotten inside him and could not be driven out. There was no doctor within 50 miles. There was no medicine. There was no one to turn to and nowhere to go. There was only the cabin that could not keep them warm, and the winter that would not relent, and a boy who was burning up while the world outside froze solid. Theron sat beside his son through that first night, feeding the fire until the heat near the hearth was almost unbearable, while 3 feet away the air was cold enough to see his breath. He watched Silas's chest rise and fall with each labored breath, and he counted those breaths the way a man counts coins when he knows he does not have enough. Margaret held the boy against her body, sharing her warmth, pressing her cheek against his burning forehead, whispering things that were not quite words and not quite prayers, but something in between. She rocked him gently the way she had when he was an infant, and the motion seemed to comfort him, even when nothing else could. Nettie watched from the corner of the sleeping platform, 7 years old and terrified. She did not understand fever or illness or the desperate mathematics of survival that her parents were calculating in silence. She understood only that her brother was sick and her parents were afraid, and that the world outside was white and frozen and impossibly large. The second day was worse. Silas stopped responding to his name. His eyes opened but did not focus. The cough came in fits that left him gasping, and between the fits, his breathing was shallow and rapid like a small animal running from something it could not outrun. Theron went outside that morning to get wood and stood for a moment in the killing cold, looking at the empty prairie, and felt something he had never felt before. He felt helpless. He was a man who solved problems. He planned, he built, he calculated and measured and worked until the work was done. But there was no amount of work that could fix this. His son was dying in a cabin that could not keep him warm, and every method Theron knew, every technique he trusted, every piece of wisdom passed down from his father, and his father's father was failing. The third day brought no change. The fever held. Silas drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words that made no sense, sometimes crying out in his sleep. Margaret did not leave his side. She did not eat. She barely drank. She held her son and watched the fire and waited for something to change, because the alternative was to accept that nothing would change, and she could not do that. On the 4th day, the fever broke. It happened in the early morning just before dawn. Theron was sitting beside the fire, exhausted beyond sleep, his eyes burning from smoke and worry, when he heard Silas say clearly and distinctly, "I am thirsty." 2 words, simple and ordinary, and so beautiful that Theron felt his throat close and his vision blur, and he had to press his palms against his eyes to stop what was coming. Margaret was already reaching for the water, her hands trembling, tears running down her face without sound. Silas recovered. Slowly over the next 2 weeks, the color returned to his face, and the strength returned to his limbs, and the cough faded from a rattle to a whisper, to nothing. He would carry a sensitivity to cold in his chest for the rest of his life, a reminder written in his lungs of what had nearly happened. But something had broken in Theron during those 4 days, and something else had been built in its place. The thing that broke was faith. Faith in the methods everyone used. Faith in the wisdom everyone trusted. Faith in the idea that because something had always been done a certain way, it must be the right way. That faith shattered like ice under a boot heel, and it never came back. What replaced it was a cold, clear understanding. The cabin had nearly killed his son. Traditional construction, the logs and chinking and sod roof that every settler on the prairie relied upon, was inadequate for this climate. It was not just insufficient, it was dangerous. It was a way of building that belonged to gentler winters and milder cold, transplanted to a landscape that punished such assumptions with suffering and death. Theron did not know yet what the alternative was, but he knew with the certainty of a man who has watched his child nearly die that he would find one. Gunnar Falk arrived at the Birch homestead on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1872. Riding alone on a sorrel horse with surveying equipment strapped to a mule that followed behind with the resigned patience of an animal accustomed to long travel. He was working for the territorial government, mapping property boundaries and establishing the section lines that would organize future settlement across the Dakota Prairie. It was tedious work that required precision and patience, two qualities Gunnar possessed in abundance after 30 years of surveying in the Northern Territories. He needed a place to camp for 3 nights while he completed the work around Theron's section, and frontier hospitality, being what it was, Theron offered his fire and his table without hesitation. Gunnar was 60 years old. His face was deeply lined, mapped by decades of sun and wind and cold, and his eyes had the careful quality of a man who measured everything he saw, not just land but people and situations, in the distance between what was said and what was meant. He was originally from Bavaria, had come to America in 30, and carried in his memory a lifetime of knowledge about how people in cold places kept themselves alive. Most settlers never asked him about any of it. They were too busy building their cabins and breaking their sod and worrying about their crops to sit down with a wandering surveyor and ask questions about construction methods from the old country. Gunnar understood this. People on the frontier were practical. They used what they knew and trusted what they could see. Abstract knowledge from foreign lands held little appeal when there was wood to cut and ground to plow. But on his second evening at the Birch homestead, sitting near the fire outside the cabin, while the spring air carried the last traces of winter cold, Gunnar asked a question that he had asked many times before at many homesteads across the territory. He asked it not because he expected a different answer, but because he believed in asking. "How did your family fare this past winter?" Most men gave him the same reply. "It was hard. The cold was bad. We managed." Words that acknowledged difficulty while preserving pride. Words that said nothing real. Theron told him the truth. He described the cold that penetrated every corner of the cabin, despite his best efforts to seal it. He described the impossible quantity of firewood required, the calculations that had seemed so sound in autumn and proved so catastrophically wrong in January. He described the gaps in the chinking that appeared like wounds in the walls, and the heat that escaped through the roof as if the sod were made of nothing. And he described Silas, the cough, the fever, the 4 days of watching his son drift toward death in a cabin that was supposed to protect him, the helplessness, the rage, the understanding that had come after hard and final that everything he knew about building shelter was wrong for this place. Gunnar listened without interrupting. He nodded occasionally, his expression suggesting not surprise but recognition. He had heard the story before, or versions of it, at homesteads across the northern plains. Different names, different children, different cabins, but the same fundamental failure. The same mismatch between method and climate. The same suffering that did not need to happen. When Theron finished, Gunnar was quiet for a time. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere on the prairie, a coyote called and received no answer. Then Gunnar spoke. "In the old country," he said, "in the northern regions, where winter is as harsh as what you have here, some people build their homes into the earth." Theron looked at him. The words made no immediate sense. Homes were above ground. Everyone knew that. Homes had walls that rose from the earth and roofs that pointed toward the sky. The idea of building into the ground was as foreign as building underwater. Gunnar continued unhurried, speaking with the patience of a man who has explained something many times and understands that the explanation needs space to be absorbed. He described the turf houses of Iceland, where families had lived for centuries in structures built into hillsides covered with earth and grass, warmed through winters that would break a conventional wooden house in weeks. He described similar constructions in Scandinavia, in parts of Central Europe, wherever wood was scarce, and winters were brutal, and people had learned through generations of trial and death that the earth itself was the best insulation available. The ground below the frost line stays at about 50 degrees year-round, Gunnar explained. His voice was matter-of-fact, the voice of a man stating measurements, not making arguments. If you build underground, you start with 50 degrees. You only need to heat from 50 to 70, not from 30 below zero to 70. You understand the difference. Theron understood immediately. The mathematics were simple. The engineering made perfect sense. Heating a space from 50 degrees to 70 required a fraction of the energy needed to heat from 30 below to 70, a fraction of the wood, a fraction of the effort, a fraction of the risk. But he had never seen such a structure. He did not know how to build one. He said as much. Gunnar picked up a stick and began drawing in the dirt beside the fire. For the next 2 hours, as the stars turned overhead and the spring chill settled around them, the old surveyor laid out the principles of earth-sheltered construction with the precision of a man who had studied these structures across 2 continents. He drew cross-sections showing how to excavate into a hillside, cutting back into the slope to create a space that was protected on 3 sides and above by the earth itself. He explained drainage, emphasizing it as the single most critical element. Water was the enemy of any underground structure. Without proper drainage, water would seep through walls and pool on floors and create conditions that were damp and cold and dangerous. Trenches filled with gravel at the base of walls, sloped floors that channeled water toward exits, clay seals between earth and interior surfaces. He described roof structures that could bear the weight of 3 feet of earth and sod, explaining why an arch design was essential. A flat roof would concentrate weight downward and eventually collapse. An arch converted downward pressure into outward pressure, distributing force across the entire structure rather than focusing it at any single point. The curve was not decoration, it was survival. He detailed ventilation methods that would prevent the buildup of smoke and carbon dioxide while maintaining warmth. A chimney with a smoke shelf to catch downdrafts. Fresh air intake through controlled gaps around the doorframe. The balance between sealing against cold and allowing enough air movement to keep the space breathable. Theron absorbed every word. He asked questions, dozens of them, and Gunnar answered each one with the same measured patience. When Theron did not understand something, Gunnar drew another diagram, erasing the first with his boot and starting fresh in the dirt. Will people not think this strange? Theron asked at one point. A family living in the ground like animals. Gunnar shrugged. The gesture carried the weight of 60 years of watching people make choices based on what others might think rather than what might keep them alive. People think many things, he said. Your family will be alive and warm. That is what matters. Gunnar left the next morning, continuing his survey work to the west. He would not return. The old surveyor moved through the territory like weather, touching lives briefly and moving on, leaving behind knowledge that most people forgot and a few people used. He had no way of knowing that the 2 hours he spent drawing in the dirt beside Theron Birch's fire would save lives and change the way an entire community thought about shelter. But that is how knowledge works sometimes. It passes from one person to another in a moment that seems ordinary while it is happening and reveals its significance only later when the knowledge is tested against reality and holds. Theron spent May and June studying the land around his homestead. He walked every slope within a mile of his cabin, examining soil composition, testing drainage patterns, noting where water collected after rain and where it ran clean. He dug test holes with a post-hole digger, pulling up samples of earth from various depths, checking for the clay and sand mixture that Gunnar had described as ideal. He found the spot 300 yards west of his existing cabin. A gentle south-facing slope soil that was packed hard but workable, and beneath it that shelf of limestone that would serve as a foundation no carpenter could improve upon. He marked the location with stakes and cord, laying out the dimensions Gunnar had suggested. 16 feet wide, 20 feet deep, a front wall partially exposed with a door and window, a back wall fully underground, a curved roof strong enough to hold the weight of the earth itself. Before the first Javi broke ground, Theron spent 2 weeks cutting and hauling timber. 30 cottonwood logs, each 10 inches in diameter and 12 feet long. Smaller poles for roof slats. Split planks for finish work. He stacked them in the sun to season, knowing they would dry better in summer heat. Margaret watched these preparations with emotions she could not fully sort. She trusted Theron's intelligence. She had seen him solve problems that defeated other men, had watched him figure out solutions through patience and calculation when brute force failed. She knew he was not a man given to whims or delusions. What he did for reasons. But the idea of living underground frightened her in ways that went beyond logic. She had grown up in a house with windows, with light, with rooms that felt open and clean and human. The thought of raising Silas and Nettie in a space carved from dirt, roofed with earth, sealed against the sky, felt like surrendering something essential. Not comfort exactly, but dignity. The dignity of living above ground in the light the way people were supposed to live. She did not say these things directly. Not at first. She asked practical questions that carried emotional weight beneath their surface. How will the children grow properly without sunlight? Will there be enough air to breathe? What happens if rain floods the space? Theron answered each question with facts and measurements. The window and open door would provide light. The ventilation system would ensure fresh air. The drainage design would prevent flooding. His answers were sound, his logic was unassailable. But logic was not what troubled Margaret. What troubled her was something deeper, something that lived in the body rather than the mind. The feeling of earth above and around pressing close, holding tight. The absence of sky. She kept her deepest fears to herself and helped Theron prepare because that was what partners did. They helped, even when they were not sure. Even when the helping felt like walking towards something they could not see. In late July, Theron began to dig. The work was brutal. Dakota summer heat matched Dakota winter cold for sheer punishing intensity. Temperatures reached 100 degrees. The sun beat down on the exposed excavation site without mercy. And the earth, Theron was moving, absorbed that heat and radiated it back, creating a space that felt like working inside an oven. He dug for 8 hours each day, sometimes more. He removed topsoil, first setting it carefully aside because the sod would be needed later for the roof. Then he cut into the hillside, removing earth in careful layers, shaping the back wall and side walls according to the dimensions he had marked. Each shovelful weighed roughly 10 pounds. He moved thousands of them. His body changed. The weight fell away. His arms and shoulders, already strong from years of physical labor, became ropey and defined the muscles standing out beneath skin that was burned dark by the sun. His hands were a landscape of calluses and cuts. The skin split in places where blisters had formed and torn and formed again. He ate everything Margaret put in front of him and woke hungry. Word spread, as word always does in scattered communities, where any break from routine becomes entertainment. A man was digging a hole in a hillside. He claimed it was going to be a house. His family was going to live in it, underground, like badgers. They came to watch. Josiah Trask came most often, riding over every few days with the dedicated regularity of a man attending a show. He would sit his horse at the edge of the excavation and observe Theron's progress with an expression that mixed amusement and genuine bewilderment. Sometimes he brought his sons, boys of 14 and 16, who were old enough to understand construction and young enough to find the spectacle fascinating. "Look carefully," Josiah told them one afternoon in mid-September, as Theron worked below them, covered in dirt and sweat. "This is what pride and stubbornness create. Remember this when you build your own home someday. Build above ground like civilized people." Deacon Hollis visited twice, once to observe, and once to express concern. He was a careful man, not given to mockery, but his worry was evident. He chose his words the way a man crosses thin ice, testing each step before committing his weight. "Perhaps he has reasons we do not understand," the deacon told Josiah after church one Sunday. "We should not mock a man trying to protect his family." "Protect them," Josiah laughed. The sound carried across Ephraim Greer's barn where services were held. "He is burying them alive. There is no light in that hole. There is no air. Rain will flood it. Snow will collapse whatever roof he thinks he can build over it. This is not protection. This is suicide with extra steps." The phrase traveled. By September, it had reached every homestead in the area. Suicide with extra steps. People repeated it when they passed by Theron's excavation, sometimes loudly enough for him to hear. Ephraim Greer came in late August, and unlike the others, he came not to watch or mock, but to warn. He stood at the edge of the hole and looked down at Theron with an expression that was kin worried and completely sincere. "Theron," he said carefully, "I know you have your reasons, but winter comes in 10 weeks, maybe 12. If this does not work, if this thing fails, there is no time to build something else. Your family will have no shelter." Theron stopped digging and leaned on his shovel. He was standing waist deep in what would become the back wall of his home, covered in dirt, his hands bleeding in 3 places, his body thinner than it had been since adolescence. "The earth maintains a constant temperature below the frost line," he said. 50 degrees year-round. Mathematics and physics do not lie, Ephraim. A traditional cabin starts with outside temperature, which is 30 below in January. My home starts at 50. I only need to add 20 degrees of heat. A cabin needs to add 100. That requires more wood, more effort, and is more likely to fail. Ephraim had no answer for the mathematics. But mathematics were abstract. The hole in the ground was concrete, and it looked like a grave. "I hope you are right," Ephraim said finally, "for your family's sake." He rode away without looking back, and Theron watched him go, and then he picked up his shovel and continued digging. The earth would not move itself. The calendar would not wait. And the winter that was coming would not care whether his neighbors approved of his methods or not. It would only care whether his family was warm. September brought cooler mornings and the smell of change on the wind, that particular scent of dying grass and distant frost that told every creature on the prairie to prepare or perish. Theron Birch had no time to notice the beauty of autumn. He was racing against the calendar with the desperation of a man who understood exactly what would happen if he lost. The excavation was complete. The hole in the hillside gaped open like a wound in the earth, 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with walls of raw clay and packed soil rising around a floor that sat 4 feet below the frost line. From above, it looked like exactly what his neighbors said it was: a grave, an absurdity, a testament to one man's stubborn refusal to accept what everyone else already knew. From inside, standing on the hard-packed floor and looking up at the walls he had shaped with his own bleeding hands, Theron saw something different. He saw potential. He saw engineering. He saw the space where his family would survive. But potential was not shelter. Engineering was not warmth. The excavation was only the beginning. What came next would determine whether Gunnar Falk's knowledge was sound or whether Josiah Trask's prediction would prove horribly correct. The back wall required the most careful work because it bore the greatest load and faced the most pressure from the earth behind it. Theron started where Gunnar had told him to start, with drainage. He dug a trench along the entire base of the back wall, 6 inches below floor level, and filled it with rocks and gravel he had hauled from the creek bed in a wheelbarrow he had built specifically for this project. The trench would catch any water that seeped through the earth behind the wall and channel it toward the sides of the structure, where it would drain away rather than pooling inside the dwelling. Water was the enemy. Gunnar had said this 3 times during their conversation, each time with greater emphasis, and Theron understood why. An underground home that stayed dry was warm and safe. An underground home that leaked was a cold, damp hole where mold grew on the walls and sickness bred in the air. The difference between the two was drainage, and drainage depended on getting every detail right the first time, because once 3 feet of earth covered the roof, there would be no going back to fix mistakes. Above the drainage layer, Theron built the back wall itself using flat stones he had collected throughout the summer. He had spent weeks walking the creek banks and the prairie, selecting stones that were large and flat and heavy enough to stay in place under pressure. He carried them back to the site 1 and 2 at a time, stacking them near the excavation until he had enough. His back ached constantly from the lifting. His knees protested every time he bent to pick up another stone. He ignored both. He placed the stones in a tight pattern against the cut earth, building upward, course by course, the way a mason builds a wall, except that his mortar was clay mixed with straw rather than lime and sand. The clay sealed gaps between stones. The straw gave the clay tensile strength, preventing it from cracking as it dried. Between the stone wall and the raw earth behind it, he packed additional clay, creating a barrier that was both structural and waterproof. As the stone wall rose, Theron incorporated horizontal timber beams at 3-foot intervals. These beams extended forward from the back wall toward the front of the dwelling, bridging the entire depth of the space. They were notched into vertical posts he had set along the sidewalls, each notch cut with the precision of a furniture maker, because that was what Theron had been before he was a homesteader. The joints were tight, the connections were solid. The entire system interlocked, creating a framework that distributed weight across multiple points, rather than concentrating stress in any single location. He worked on the sidewalls next, and here the engineering became more complex because the walls transitioned from fully underground at the back to partially exposed at the front. The underground portions received double-layer construction. The inner layer was timber vertical posts, spaced 2 feet apart with horizontal planks fitted between them, each plank shaped to sit flush against its neighbors with gaps so small that a knife blade would not pass through. The outer layer was stone and clay, identical to the back wall construction. Between the two layers, Theron left a 6-inch gap that he filled with tightly packed prairie grass. The grass was insulation. Each individual stem trapped a tiny column of air, and thousands of stems packed together created a barrier that resisted heat transfer, the way a thick wool blanket resists cold. But the grass served a second purpose that was equally important. If moisture penetrated the outer stone and clay layer, the grass would absorb it and allow it to dry through natural air circulation within the gap, preventing the water from ever reaching the interior timber where it would cause rot and structural failure. For the portions of sidewall that rose above ground at the front, Theron used hewn logs similar to traditional cabin construction, but with differences that reflected everything he had learned from his first cabin's failures. He selected logs with minimal taper, shaping them so carefully that they fit together with gaps of less than half an inch. He sealed those gaps with the same clay and straw mixture he used underground, applying it in layers, letting each layer dry before adding the next, building up a seal that was dense and flexible and resistant to the cracking that had plagued his first cabin's chinking. The front wall was the most visible part of the structure and the only element that would look remotely like conventional construction. Theron built it using the thickest logs he had cut, each one at least 12 inches in diameter. But instead of stacking them horizontally, which created the joints and gaps that Wind exploited so ruthlessly in traditional cabins, he stood them vertically. He sank the bottom 3 feet of each log into the ground below floor level and pinned them together at the top with cross beams, creating a front wall with no horizontal joints for wind to penetrate. Into this wall, he framed a door opening 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, large enough for adults to pass through comfortably, small enough to minimize heat loss. Beside the door, set high in the wall, he framed a window opening 18 inches square. It would accept a pane of glass if he could ever afford one. For now, a wooden shutter and oiled paper would serve. The construction consumed September and most of October. Theron worked from first light until he could no longer see his hands in front of his face, pausing only to eat whatever Margaret brought to the site and to drink water from the creek. He lost track of the days. He lost track of the weeks. His world narrowed to the next stone to be placed, the next beam to be notched, the next plank to be shaped and fitted. His body operated on a level below conscious thought, performing the physical motions of construction, while his mind ran calculations and anticipated problems and planned the next sequence of steps. Margaret brought him food twice a day, walking the 300 yards from the canvas tent to the construction site with bread and dried meat and whatever else she could prepare. She stood at the entrance of the emerging structure each time and looked inside, and each time her feelings shifted slightly on the spectrum between fear and hope. The space was larger than she had imagined from the outside. The walls were smoother than she had expected. The craftsmanship was evident in every joint and every fitted plank. Theron had not built a crude hole in the ground. He had built something that showed genuine skill and care, but it was still underground. The ceiling still pressed down with its weight of earth. The walls still absorbed sound in a way that made the space feel sealed and close. Light entered only through the door and the small window opening, creating shadows that pooled in the corners and along the back wall where the fireplace waited. She tried to imagine sleeping here, cooking here, teaching Silas his letters and Nettie her sewing here, living here through an entire winter while the world above froze and the earth around them held steady at its constant 50 degrees. The images would not form properly. They kept colliding with memories of the house she had grown up in, the house in Wisconsin with its wide windows and its wooden floors, and its rooms that smelled of bread and soap rather than clay and raw earth. One afternoon in late September, she brought Theron water and stood watching him work on the roof framework. He was placing the arched saplings that would form the skeleton of the curved roof, bending each one into shape with a technique he had adapted from his furniture-making days. The green cottonwood, soaked for 3 days in the creek, was pliable enough to hold the curve, and Theron secured each arch at ground level on opposite walls, spacing them 18 inches apart, building the dome shape that would define the ceiling of their home. "Theron," she said quietly, "are you certain this will be safe?" He climbed down from where he was working. His hands were cut and calloused, the skin cracked in places that would not heal until he stopped working. His face was deeply tanned from months in the sun. He looked thinner than she had ever seen him, worn down by physical labor and the constant weight of criticism from people who should have been his community. But his eyes were clear, focused. They were not the eyes of a man consumed by delusion or driven by pride. They were the eyes of a man who had calculated every angle and measured every risk and arrived at a conclusion he trusted completely. "I am certain," he said. "The earth is stable. The structure is sound. We will be warm." "But it is so dark," Margaret said. "How will the children grow properly without sunlight?" Theron had considered this question many times, turning it over in his mind during the long hours of digging and building. He did not dismiss it. He understood that Margaret was asking about more than light. She was asking about what kind of life their children would have in a space that was fundamentally different from every home either of them had known. "We will keep the door open during good weather," he said. "The window will provide light. We will spend time outside when we can." But Margaret remembered last winter. Remember how cold it was. Remember Silas those 4 days. Would you prefer more light and less warmth, or less light and more safety? She had no answer that satisfied both her heart and her mind. The heart wanted windows and sky, and the normal life she had been raised to expect. The mind remembered Silas burning with fever in a cabin that could not keep him warm, and the mind knew that Theron was right, and the heart knew it too, but knowing and accepting were different things. "The neighbors think we are mad," she said. "The neighbors thought my father was mad when he tried a new planting method that doubled his corn yield," Theron replied. "People always think innovation is madness until it works. Then they adopt it and claim they knew it was a good idea all along." "What if you are wrong?" she asked. "What if this does not work and winter comes and we have nothing else?" Theron took her hands. They were rough from farm work, strong and capable, the hands of a woman who had helped him build a life from nothing on the open prairie. "I have calculated every aspect of this structure," he said. "The mathematics are sound. The principles are proven in other cold regions of the world. The only variable is my execution, whether I have built it correctly. And I am being as careful as I know how to be. If I am wrong, it will be because I made a mistake in construction, not because the concept is flawed. But I do not believe I have made mistakes." Margaret wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that these months of brutal labor would result in safety for their family. But doubt lingered like cold air at the bottom of a well, heavy and persistent and impossible to ignore completely. The roof was the most critical element of the entire structure, and Theron approached it with the intensity of a man who understood that everything depended on getting it right. The arch framework was already in place, the bent saplings forming a graceful curve from wall to wall. But the saplings alone were not strong enough to bear the weight that would be placed upon them. 3 feet of earth and sod plus snow that could add thousands of pounds during heavy storms. The roof needed to support weight that would crush any flat structure and needed to do it reliably year after year without maintenance or adjustment. Theron reinforced the arches with horizontal members, thin poles running perpendicular to the curved saplings tied at every intersection with cord he had twisted from prairie grass fibers. The result was a lattice that was rigid and strong despite being made from relatively thin materials. The lattice distributed force in every direction. Downward pressure became outward pressure, became lateral pressure, spreading across the entire structure rather than concentrating at any point. Over the lattice he laid split planks. Each one was individually shaped to follow the curve of the roof, and each overlapped the plank below it like shingles on a conventional roof. He secured them with wooden pegs driven through the planks into the arch framework beneath. The pegs were whittled from hardwood, each one tapered to a point that would bite into the softer cottonwood and hold fast. The planking took 2 full weeks. Every plank had to be split from a log shaped with a draw knife curved to match the arch beneath it, fitted against its neighbors, and pegged into place. Theron's hands bled constantly from splinters and cuts. The draw knife slipped twice, opening gashes on his left hand that Margaret bandaged with strips torn from an old shirt. He kept working. There was no time to stop. There was no time to heal. When the planking was finished, the roof structure was complete and it was beautiful in its way. A smooth, curved surface that looked almost organic, as if it had grown from the earth, rather than being built by a man with bleeding hands and a borrowed idea. The layering system that would cover this roof was the culmination of everything Gunnar had taught and everything Theron had learned through months of planning. Each layer served a specific purpose, and the order mattered absolutely. Theron had written the sequence on a piece of paper that he kept in his shirt pocket, checking it repeatedly as he worked, because a mistake in the layering would be invisible until it caused failure, and failure would come at the worst possible time. The first layer was birch bark. Theron had spent 2 weeks in August stripping bark from birch trees along the creek, just selecting pieces that were large and intact and free of holes or thin spots. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, a quality that the tree had evolved over millions of years, and it was flexible enough to conform to the curve of the roof without cracking. He laid the bark in overlapping sheets across the entire surface, starting at the bottom edge and working upward so that each course overlapped the one below. Water running down the roof would flow over the surface of the bark rather than finding gaps between pieces. At every overlap, he applied pine pitch as an adhesive, sealing the seams against infiltration. The second layer was clay, the same mixture of clay straw and sand that he had used throughout the construction, mixed to a consistency that was thick but spreadable. He applied it by hand, working on his knees, on top of the planked roof, spreading the clay in a layer about 2 inches thick across the entire surface. This layer sealed any gaps the birch bark might have missed and provided the first layer of thermal mass. As it dried over the following week, it hardened into a shell that was both waterproof and slightly insulating. The third layer was prairie grass. Theron had harvested it in late summer when the stems were tall and dry and full of the trapped air that made them such effective insulation. He bundled the grass into thick mats and laid them in a layer 10 inches deep, overlapping so no gaps existed. This layer was the primary thermal barrier, the element that would prevent heat from escaping upward through the roof and cold from pressing down into the living space. 10 inches of packed grass provided insulation equivalent to several inches of the modern materials that would not be invented for another century. The fourth layer was earth, the topsoil Theron had carefully set aside when he began excavation months earlier. He spread it in a layer 3 feet thick using his homemade wheelbarrow. Each load weighed approximately 100 pounds. He made hundreds of trips pushing the wheelbarrow up a ramp he had constructed against the side of the mound, dumping the earth, spreading it evenly with a rake, then walking back down for another load. The work consumed days. His legs burned from the constant climbing. His shoulders ached from pushing. His lower back seized up twice, forcing him to lie flat on the ground for 20 minutes until the muscles released. He could not afford to rest longer than that. The calendar was his enemy. Every day that passed brought winter one day closer. The fifth and final layer was sod. Thick chunks of living prairie grouse and roots and soil cut from the land around the homestead in squares roughly 18 inches across. He laid them grass side up, fitting the pieces together like a living puzzle. The roots would interlock and grow, binding the sod together and binding it to the earth beneath, creating a living roof that would hold all the layers in place through wind and rain and the freeze-thaw cycles of Dakota seasons. When the last piece of sod was placed, Theron stood on top of the mound that covered his home and looked out across the prairie. The view was unremarkable, grass and sky and the distant line of trees along the creek. But beneath his feet, invisible to anyone who did not know it was there, was a structure that had consumed 5 months of his life and every ounce of strength and knowledge he possessed. The chimney rose from the mound like a single stone finger pointing at the sky. It was the only visible indication that something existed beneath the grass-covered earth. Theron had built it from flat stones mortared with clay, narrow in cross-section, only 8 inches square, because a narrow chimney created better draft than a wide one. It rose 10 feet from the floor of the dwelling to 4 feet above the peak of the earthen roof, tall enough to ensure adequate draw and to prevent snow from blocking the opening. Inside the chimney, 3 feet above the firebox, Theron had constructed a smoke shelf. This shelf served purposes that were invisible but critical. It caught downdrafts, the cold air that sometimes pushed down a chimney during storms, and redirected them upward instead of allowing them to blow smoke into the living space. It also created turbulence in the rising column of air, increasing the efficiency of the draft and ensuring that smoke was pulled up and out rather than lingering inside. The firebox itself was smaller than what most cabins used. 2 feet wide, 18 inches deep, 2 feet tall. In a conventional cabin, a large fireplace was essential because so much heat was lost through walls and roof that only a massive fire could maintain livable temperatures. In an earth-sheltered dwelling where heat loss was minimal, a large fire would be wasteful and even dangerous, overheating the sealed space. Theron's small firebox would burn modest fires that produced exactly the amount of heat needed and no more. Ventilation was the final challenge, and in some ways the most dangerous one. A sealed underground space without adequate air circulation would become suffocating. Carbon dioxide from breathing and smoke from the fire would accumulate. Fresh oxygen would be consumed and not replaced. A family could fall asleep warm and comfortable and never wake up. Theron addressed this by leaving small, deliberate gaps around the doorframe. Not the accidental gaps that plagued conventional cabin construction, but controlled openings that allowed fresh air to be drawn into the dwelling as the chimney pulled used air out. The chimney's draft created a constant, gentle circulation, pulling fresh air in through the door gaps, moving it through the living space, and exhausting it up the chimney along with smoke from the fire. The system was self-regulating. As long as the fire burned, the air moved. The first week of October brought cold winds and the smell of snow. Theron had finished the structure 3 days earlier, and now the family stood outside their canvas tent, looking at the dwelling that would either save their lives or confirm every dark prediction their neighbors had made. The entrance was a wooden door set into the front wall. Solid planks fitted tightly together and hung on iron hinges that Theron had traded 2 bushels of corn to acquire. Above and around the door, earth and grass covered everything, creating a low mound that rose perhaps 8 feet at its highest point before sloping gently down to ground level on all sides. From a distance, it looked like a natural feature of the landscape, a small hill, an unremarkable rise in the prairie. Only the door and the chimney suggested that something human existed within. Margaret stood holding Nettie's hand. The girl was 7 small for her age, with dark hair like her mother and wide eyes that were trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She understood that this mound of earth was supposed to be their home, but the understanding was intellectual, not intuitive. Nothing about it looked like a home. Nothing about it looked like a place where people belonged. Silas stood beside his father, 10 years old, still carrying the thinnesses that his winter illness had left behind. He trusted his father in the way that sons trust fathers who have proven themselves reliable, but even trust could not entirely suppress the strangeness of what they were about to do. "It looks like a giant's grave," Nettie whispered. "It looks like safety," Theron replied. He opened the door and stepped inside. The family followed. The interior was dim, lit only by light coming through the doorway and the small window set high in the front wall. As their eyes adjusted, the space Theron had created revealed itself gradually, the way a landscape reveals itself when clouds move away from the sun. The room was 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a curved ceiling that rose to 7 feet at its center. The walls were smooth, plastered with clay mixed with fine sand that Theron had applied in 3 coats, each one rubbed to a finish that was almost polished. The floor was packed, earth-hard and level, swept clean. Against the back wall in the corner, the stone fireplace waited for its first fire. Along one side, Theron had built a sleeping platform raised off the ground, wide enough for all 4 of them. On the other side, a table and 2 benches provided space for meals and work. The air smelled of earth and clay and dry grass. It was cool but not cold, noticeably warmer than the October wind outside. And there was something else, something harder to name, a feeling of solidity, of weight, of being held by the earth rather than exposed to the sky. Margaret stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in every detail. Her feelings were complicated in ways she could not have explained to anyone, perhaps not even to herself. The space was genuinely impressive. The craftsmanship was evident in every surface. Theron had created something remarkable through months of labor that had pushed him to the edge of his physical limits. But it was still underground. The ceiling curved above her like the inside of a shell, and she could feel the weight of 3 feet of earth pressing down on it. The walls absorbed sound, creating a quiet that was deeper than silence. There was a sense of being enclosed that went beyond shelter into something she did not have a word for. "Can we truly live here?" she asked. Theron walked to the fireplace and began arranging kindling he had brought in earlier. Small sticks placed in a careful pyramid, the way his father had taught him, with shavings of dry bark beneath for tinder. "We will light the fire and see how it draws," he said. "We will sleep here tonight and see how it feels. If something is wrong, if something does not work, we still have time to make changes." He struck flint against steel. Sparks fell into the bark shavings. A thin curl of smoke rose, followed by a small flame that caught the kindling and grew. The fire built steadily, and the smoke rose into the chimney and vanished upward without hesitation. No smoke curled back into the room. No downdraft pushed the flame sideways. The draft was strong and steady, pulling air up and out, exactly as Gunnar had described, exactly as Theron had designed. Within minutes, the fire was burning cleanly, and heat began to spread through the small space. Not the fierce localized heat of a cabin fireplace that scorched everything within 3 feet and left the rest of the room freezing. This was different. The heat radiated from the fire and was absorbed by the earth walls and clay plaster and stone fireplace surrounding. Those surfaces held the heat and radiated it back gently and evenly, warming the entire space rather than just the area nearest the flames. Within an hour, the temperature inside the dwelling was comfortable. Not just bearable, comfortable. Warm enough to remove a jacket. Warm enough for the children to sit on the sleeping platform without blankets. Warm enough that Margaret, standing near the back wall, 20 feet from the fire, could feel warmth on her face. She did not say anything for a long time. She stood and felt the warmth and listened to the fire and watched Silas and Nettie exploring their new home with the curious energy of children discovering something strange and fascinating. Silas was examining the chimney, trying to see up the flue. Nettie was pressing her palm against the clay wall, feeling its smooth, cool surface. That night, the family slept in the earth shelter for the first time. Theron kept the fire going, feeding it small amounts of wood every few hours, maintaining a flame that was modest, almost delicate. Outside, the October temperature dropped below freezing. Inside, the dwelling held at 65 degrees without effort. Margaret lay awake for a long time listening. She could hear the fire. She could hear Theron's breathing and the children's breathing. She could hear very faintly the wind moving across the mound above them, a sound so distant and muffled that it might have been imagined. What she could not hear was the cold. In the cabin, cold had been audible. The wind that found every gap in the chinking made sounds, thin whistles and deep moans, and the constant sighing of air pushing through spaces too small to see but large enough to steal warmth. Here there was none of that. The silence was complete. The warmth was constant. The earth held them. She was not sure when her fear began to change. It did not disappear. It shifted. It moved from the front of her mind to a place further back, still present, but no longer dominant. In its place, something else grew. Not confidence exactly, not yet, but the beginning of trust. The first tentative sense that perhaps this strange underground space was not a grave, but what Theron had always said it was, a home. November tested every homestead in the territory. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero on several nights. Wind swept across the prairie with nothing to stop it, creating drifts and making exposed travel dangerous. The cold was not yet at its worst, but it was bad enough to reveal the strengths and weaknesses of every structure in the region. Traditional cabins became battlegrounds between fire and cold. Families huddled near their fireplaces, feeding logs into flames that consumed wood at rates that made careful men do anxious arithmetic with their stockpiles. Chinking cracked. Roofs leaked heat. Floors radiated cold upward through worn boot soles. The pattern was universal and relentless. Inside the earth shelter, conditions were different in ways that became more pronounced with each passing day. Theron maintained a fire that was nothing like the roaring blazes other families required. His fire was small, almost delicate. It burned perhaps 5 pounds of wood every 12 hours, a quantity so modest that it seemed impossible for it to produce adequate heat. But the interior temperature held steady at 65 degrees, even when the outside air dropped to zero or below. The thermal mass of the earth was performing exactly as Gunnar had predicted. The ground below frost line maintained its constant temperature of approximately 50 degrees. The 3 feet of earth and sod covering the roof insulated so effectively that heat loss upward was negligible. The sealed walls prevented drafts. The small interior volume meant there was simply less space to heat. Everything worked together, each element supporting every other element, creating a system that required minimal energy to maintain comfortable conditions. Margaret's cautious acceptance deepened into something she had not expected: gratitude. The children were warm, Not just surviving, warm. Silas, whose lungs still carried the damage from last winter's fever, breathed easily in the steady warmth of the earth shelter. Nettie played on the sleeping platform in her underclothes, comfortable enough to forget that winter existed outside. The fire required so little wood that the supply Theron had cut, which would have lasted perhaps 6 weeks in their old cabin, would now last the entire winter with wood to spare. By mid-November, other families were struggling. Josiah Trask had burned through half his winter wood supply. His cabin, built with conventional methods, fought the cold the conventional way by burning fuel at rates that outpaced even generous estimates. His wife and sons wore heavy clothing inside the cabin at all times. The far corners of the room were too cold to use. Life contracted to the area around the fireplace, a shrinking circle of warmth in an expanding sea of cold. Ephraim Greer spent 6 hours a day cutting additional firewood to supplement what he had stored. His calculations, like Theron's the previous year, had proven optimistic. The wood he had thought sufficient for winter was disappearing at a rate that would exhaust it well before spring. Deacon Hollis and his family slept in layers of blankets huddled near their fire because the far end of their cabin was too cold to occupy. The deacon rationed wood with the discipline of a man who understood scarcity, burning less than his family needed to stay truly comfortable, stretching each log as far as it would go and counting the weeks until spring with quiet desperation. Word began to travel. Settlers passing through mentioned the unusual dwelling where a family was living comfortably while everyone around them fought for survival. Some people rode out specifically to see it, curiosity overcoming skepticism. Theron welcomed visitors, showing them the construction, explaining the principles, answering their questions with patience and detail. Josiah Trask came on November the 23rd. He came on the pretense of borrowing a tool, a draw knife, that he claimed to need for a repair to his cabin door. It was a thin excuse, and both men knew it. Josiah did not need a draw knife. He needed to see for himself whether the stories were true. Theron invited him inside. Josiah ducked through the door and straightened up in the interior of the earth shelter, and what happened in the next few seconds was written across his face as clearly as words on a page. First came surprise, the involuntary widening of eyes as the warmth hit him. Real warmth, not the desperate localized heat of a fireplace struggling against cold, but an even pervasive warmth that filled the entire space. Then came confusion because the fire burning in the corner was small, almost negligible, nothing like the roaring blaze that Josiah maintained in his own cabin, and yet the room was warmer than his home had been since October. Then came something else, something that moved behind his eyes and settled in the lines around his mouth. It was not shame exactly. Not yet. It was the beginning of a question that Josiah was not ready to ask, a question about whether the man he had mocked and pitied and used as an object lesson for his sons might have been right all along. He stood in the center of the room for a long time. He looked at the curved ceiling. He touched the smooth clay walls. He watched the small fire burning with quiet efficiency. He felt the warmth that came not from the flames but from the earth itself, stored and radiated, constant and reliable. Then he left without saying a word about any of it. He took the draw knife he did not need and rode home to his cabin, where the fire demanded feeding and the cold crept through every gap in the walls. It was the first time Josiah Trask had nothing to say about Theron Birch's home in the ground. December came and deepened. January arrived with deceptive calm. The first 2 weeks brought cold but manageable weather temperatures in the teens during the day, dropping to 0 or slightly below at night. Snow fell intermittently, adding inches to the accumulation that covered the prairie, but nothing that suggested unusual danger. Families settled into winter routines, rationing wood, venturing out when necessary, counting weeks until spring. Theron maintained his small fire and watched the sky. He had learned to read weather during his 2 years on the Dakota prairie, not from books or instruction, but from observation and consequence. He had learned that certain changes in wind direction preceded storms. He had learned that unusual warmth in midwinter was not a gift, but a warning. He had learned that the sky communicated its intentions through cloud formations that most people never bothered to read. On January the 16th, 1873, Theron noticed the wind shifting from northwest to northeast. The temperature rose slightly during the day, reaching 25 degrees by midday, when it should have been falling. The clouds took on a particular appearance that he had seen only once before, a flat gray blanket that stretched from horizon to horizon without break or variation, as if the sky had been covered with a single sheet of iron. That evening, Theron brought extra firewood inside the earth shelter, stacking it along the wall near the fireplace. More wood than he would normally keep inside. Enough for a week. Margaret noticed but did not ask. She had learned to trust his readings of the sky the way she had learned to trust his construction of their home gradually, and through evidence rather than faith. He brought in additional water, filling every container they owned from the creek. He checked the door seal, pressing his palm against the frame, feeling for drafts, finding none. He checked the window shutter, confirming it was tight. He examined the chimney cap, a flat stone placed at an angle over the chimney top that prevented snow from falling directly into the flue while still allowing smoke to escape. Margaret watched these preparations from the sleeping platform where she was mending one of Silas's shirts by firelight. The children were already asleep, Alice on his back with one arm thrown above his head, Nettie curled on her side with her knees pulled up. They slept deeply and easily in the earth shelter, warmer and more comfortable than they had ever been in the canvas tent or the old cabin. "How long?" Margaret asked quietly, not wanting to wake the children. Theron looked at her across the small space firelight moving on his face, shadows pooling in the hollows of his cheeks that months of labor had carved. "3 days," he said. "Maybe 4. He paused. "And it will be bad." The storm arrived on the morning of January the 17th at dawn. It began quietly, almost gently, with small flakes falling straight down through still air. There was no wind, no sound, just the soft accumulation of white on white, each flake landing on the one before it, with a silence so complete that it felt deliberate, as if the sky were holding its breath before speaking. Within an hour, the wind came. It did not build gradually. It arrived like something unleashed, shifting to due north, and increasing in strength with a speed that caught even experienced settlers off guard. One moment the flakes were falling vertically in calm air. The next they were driving horizontally, propelled by gusts that howled across the open prairie, with nothing to stop them. Nothing to slow them, nothing between the Arctic North and the Dakota Territory, but 1,000 miles of flat grassland that offered wind the same resistance as open water. The snow thickened. Visibility dropped from miles to yards to feet. The temperature, which had been an almost pleasant 25 degrees the day before, fell 20 degrees in 2 hours, plunging to 15 below zero by noon and continuing to fall through the afternoon like a stone dropped into a well with no bottom. Inside the earth shelter, Theron heard the storm arrive as a distant moan. Not the sharp howl that cabin dwellers heard, the sound of wind finding gaps and forcing itself through, but something muffled and remote filtered through 3 feet of earth and sod, until it was reduced to a low, steady vibration that was more felt than heard. He added a small amount of wood to the fire, not because the temperature inside had changed. It had not. The dwelling held at 68 degrees, the same temperature it had maintained for weeks. He added wood because the sound of the fire was comforting, and because he understood that the next few days would test the patience and nerve of his family, even if they never tested the structure. Margaret was already preparing breakfast. She moved through the morning routine with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to manage a household in a space that was 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Beans were soaking near the fire. Salt pork was sliced and ready for the skillet. Cornbread batter was mixed in the wooden bowl that Theron had carved during their first autumn on the prairie. The children woke to the smell of cooking and the distant sound of wind, a combination that created a strange atmosphere of domestic normalcy set against something vast and violent happening just beyond the walls of earth that surrounded them. Silas climbed down from the sleeping platform and pressed his ear against the back wall. He could feel a faint vibration, the trembling of earth under assault from wind that was accelerating towards speeds that would have been difficult to believe if anyone had been standing outside with an instrument to measure them. "Is it bad?" he asked his father. "It is getting worse," Theron said, "but we are safe here." The boy accepted this with the trust of a child who had spent months watching his father build something extraordinary and who slept each night in the proof of that effort. He sat down at the table and waited for breakfast. Nettie did not ask about the storm. She was 7 years old, and the earth shelter was the only home she remembered clearly. The cabin and the tent before it had faded into the kind of vague impressions that early childhood leaves behind, more feeling than memory. To Nettie, living underground was simply how people lived. The wind above was something that happened in another world, separated from hers by walls of stone and clay and 3 feet of packed earth that had never let anything through. She played with the wooden animals Theron had carved for her, arranging them on the sleeping platform in patterns that made sense only to her and the morning past. 2 miles east in the cabin that Josiah Trask had built with such pride and such confidence, the morning was a different experience entirely. The wind found the cabin the way it found every cabin on the prairie, by searching every surface for weakness and exploiting whatever it discovered. Josiah's construction was better than most. His logs were well fitted, his chinking was carefully applied, his roof was solid and his chimney drew clean. But better than most was not enough for what was coming. Better than most was still a structure that relied on wood and mud and sod to hold back cold that would reach 42 degrees below zero before the storm was finished. The fireplace consumed wood at a rate Josiah had never experienced. He fed logs into the flames, continuously adding fuel every 20 minutes, maintaining a blaze that roared and crackled, and threw heat that was fierce within arm's reach and meaningless beyond. The temperature inside the cabin hovered barely above freezing, despite the constant fire. Frost formed on the interior walls where moisture from breathing condensed and froze, creating delicate patterns of ice that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. His wife and 2 sons huddled in blankets near the fire. They wore every piece of clothing they owned, layered one garment upon another until they looked shapeless and bulky, moving with the awkward stiffness of people wearing too many clothes and still not warm enough. The far end of the cabin where the sleeping platform stood was abandoned. The water in the bucket near the door had developed a skin of ice that thickened throughout the morning. Josiah watched the woodpile with the focus of a man watching an hourglass. Each log that went into the fire was a log that would not be there later. Simple mathematics. He had cut and stacked what he believed was adequate for a winter, a generous supply calculated against normal consumption. But the blizzard was consuming 3 days' worth of wood every 12 hours, and the storm showed no sign of ending. He did the calculation in his head, then did it again, hoping the numbers would change. They did not. At the current rate of consumption, his wood supply would run out before the storm ended. By evening of the first day, snow had accumulated 18 inches on level ground and formed drifts 6 feet high wherever obstacles interrupted the wind. The temperature reached 30 below zero. Inside the Trask cabin, the battle between fire and cold continued without pause, and the fire was slowly losing. The storm continued through the night. It did not weaken, it did not pause. It maintained its assault with a consistency that felt almost malicious, as if the weather itself had decided to test every structure on the prairie to destruction and would not stop until the testing was complete. By morning of the second day, accumulation exceeded 3 feet on level ground. Drifts reached 12 feet against the walls of cabins and barns. The wind had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified, gusting at speeds that exceeded 70 miles per hour, creating conditions where exposed skin would freeze in under 3 minutes. Inside the earth shelter, Theron added another small piece of wood to the fire and sat down at the table across from Margaret. The contrast between what was happening inside their home and what was happening everywhere else in the territory was so extreme that it created a sensation of unreality. The children were playing, Margaret was sewing, the fire burned quietly. The temperature held steady at 68 degrees. The air was fresh, pulled in through the door gaps by the chimney's constant draft. There was food for weeks and wood for months and water in every container they owned. They were comfortable, not surviving. Comfortable. While outside, the most violent storm in Dakota Territory history was killing livestock in minutes and threatening to kill people in hours. Margaret looked up from her sewing. Firelight caught her face, and Theron saw something there that he had not seen before. Not fear, not anxiety, not the complicated mix of trust and doubt that had characterized her feelings about the earth shelter since the beginning. What he saw was understanding, complete and quiet, and arrived at through months of experience rather than a single moment of revelation. She looked at the curved ceiling above them, the ceiling that held 3 feet of earth and was holding it without strain or sound. She looked at the walls that radiated warmth they had absorbed from the fire, warmth that would have escaped through any conventional construction. She looked at her children, warm and safe, and playing as if the world outside were not trying to freeze everything alive into silence. "You were right," she said. She said it simply, without drama, the way a person states a fact that has become too obvious to leave unspoken. Theron did not respond immediately. He had not built the earth shelter to be proven right. He had built it to keep his family alive. Being right was incidental to the purpose. But hearing Margaret say it, hearing the doubt finally leave her voice and be replaced by something solid and settled, mattered to him in ways he would never fully articulate. He nodded once and added another piece of wood to the fire that did not need it. The blizzard reached its full fury on the second day. Wind speeds gusted to 80 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to 42 degrees below zero. Snow fell at a rate of 3 inches per hour, accumulating so heavily that the boundary between earth and sky dissolved into a white void where direction and distance ceased to have meaning. 3 miles southeast, Deacon Hollis faced a crisis that had moved beyond desperate into something approaching terminal. The deacon had rationed his wood supply with discipline and care, burning less than his family needed to stay truly warm, accepting discomfort as the price of longevity. His wife and 3 children slept in their coats and hats, layered in blankets and pressed together near the fireplace for shared warmth. It was not comfortable, it was not even adequate, but it was sustainable, or so the deacon had believed. The blizzard changed the calculation entirely. The cold was so intense and so unrelenting that even his careful rationing could not keep pace. Wood that should have lasted days disappeared in hours. The fire demanded more and more fuel to maintain even minimal warmth against cold that pressed in from every direction, through the walls, through the roof, up through the frozen floor. On the morning of the third day, the wood ran out. The deacon stood before his fireplace and watched the last flames consume the last split log and reduce it to coals that glowed briefly and then began to fade. The implications were immediate and absolute. Without fire, the cabin would reach outside temperature within hours. At 42 below zero, that meant death. Not eventual death, not slow death, death that would come with the certainty of a door closing. He looked at the table he had built the previous spring, solid pine joined with pegs sanded smooth. He had been proud of that table. It was the first real piece of furniture in their Dakota home, built with care during the optimism of warm weather, when winter was an abstraction rather than a killing force. He took his axe and broke it apart. The sound of the axe hitting the table filled the cabin with a violence that made his children flinch. His wife pressed her hands over her mouth, but did not speak. There was nothing to say. The mathematics were simple and pitiless. Burn the furniture or freeze. The chairs followed the table into the fire. Then the sleeping platform. Theron Birch had built sleeping platforms too, and shelves and benches, all from wood that burned well because it was dry and seasoned. The deacon fed his family's possessions into the flames one piece at a time, watching months of work and years of aspiration reduced to heat that lasted minutes before the cold demanded more. By evening of the third day, they had burned everything burnable except the structural logs of the cabin itself. The deacon looked at his wife and 3 children in the dying light of the last flames and understood with terrible clarity that they might not survive the night. The cabin was cooling rapidly. The cold that had been held at bay by constant fire was advancing into the room like water filling a sinking boat, rising from the floor, pressing in from the walls, descending from the ceiling, filling every space that warmth had occupied. He knew where the Birch family lived. He knew that Theron had built something different, something that people said was working when traditional cabins were failing. The earth shelter was perhaps 3/4 of a mile across open prairie. In the blizzard at 42 below zero, with wind gusting to 80 miles per hour, and visibility measured in feet, 3/4 of a mile might as well have been 100. But staying in the cabin meant death. Moving meant a chance. However small, however desperate, a chance was more than what the cabin offered. He told his family what he planned to do. He would go to the Birch shelter. He would bring back help or firewood, or at minimum information about how long the storm might last. He did not believe these words as he said them. He believed only that movement was better than stillness, when stillness meant freezing. His wife begged him not to go. His children cried. He wrapped himself in every layer available, tied a rope around his waist with the other end secured to the cabin door frame, and stepped outside. The storm hit him like a physical blow. The wind knocked him sideways before he had taken 2 steps. The cold penetrated through his layers as if they were made of paper. Snow filled his eyes and mouth and packed against his face until he could not breathe without turning away from the wind and gasping for air that burned his lungs with its temperature. He made it perhaps 200 yards. The rope played out behind him, his only connection to the cabin, his only guarantee that he could find his way back. Beyond the rope's reach, there was nothing. No landmarks, no direction, no way to know whether he was moving toward the Birch homestead or away into empty prairie where his body would not be found until spring. He turned back. The rope guided him home. He stumbled through the door and collapsed on the floor of a cabin that was now only marginally warmer than the world outside, and his family gathered around him, and they waited for whatever would come next. The storm broke on the morning of January the 20th. It ended the way it had begun, with a transition so sudden that it felt unnatural. The wind diminished from a howl to a moan, to a whisper, to silence. The snow tapered from a blinding curtain to scattered flakes to nothing. The clouds parted, pulling back like curtains on a stage, revealing a sky of pale winter blue that seemed impossibly clean and bright after 3 days of white chaos. The temperature remained at 20 below zero, still dangerous, still capable of killing the unprepared. But the wind was gone, and without wind, cold was manageable. Cold without wind was an enemy that could be faced and endured. Cold with wind was something else entirely, something that no amount of clothing or determination could survive for long. Theron opened the door of the earth shelter for the first time since the storm had begun. Snow had drifted against the entrance, but only to a depth of about 3 feet. The low profile of the structure, rising barely 8 feet above the surrounding ground, had prevented the massive drifts that buried cabin doors under 10 and 15 feet of snow. He cleared the entrance with a shovel in 20 minutes and stepped outside. The world was transformed. Every feature of the landscape had been erased and redrawn in white. The prairie, which normally rolled in gentle waves of brown grass, was now an unbroken expanse of snow that reflected sunlight with an intensity that hurt the eyes. Trees along the distant creek were bent under loads of white, their branches bowed to the ground, some broken entirely. There were no tracks, no marks, no evidence that anything had ever moved across this land. The storm had wiped the prairie clean. The air was so cold that it hurt to breathe, each inhalation sharp and raw, each exhalation producing a cloud of vapor that froze and fell like tiny crystals. The silence was enormous. After 3 days of wind, the absence of sound was almost overwhelming, a quiet so deep that Theron could hear his own heartbeat. He stood in front of his home, turning slowly, scanning the white landscape for anything that needed his attention. The chimney rose from the mound behind him, a thin column of smoke drifting upward in the still air. The earth shelter looked exactly as it had before the storm. No damage, no displacement, no structural change of any kind. The blizzard that had battered and buried and broken conventional cabins across the territory had passed over the earth shelter the way a river passes over a stone, on the bottom flowing around and above without making contact. It was then that Theron saw something dark against the snow. It was perhaps 50 yards from his door, a shape that did not belong in the white uniformity of the post-storm landscape. At first he thought it was a fallen log, a piece of timber torn from someone's cabin and deposited by the wind. Then he thought it was the carcass of an animal, a deer or calf that had been caught in the open and frozen where it fell. Then the shape moved. The movement was small, a slight shifting, a twitch. The kind of motion that a living thing makes when it is almost but not quite finished with living. Theron ran. The snow was thigh-deep in places, and he struggled through it with the churning, desperate gait of a man running through water. His boots broke through the crust and sank, and he pulled them free and took another step and sank again. 50 yards took longer than it should have. Each step was a negotiation with the snow, each yard a small victory. He reached the dark shape and dropped to his knees. It was Josiah Trask, the man who had sat on his horse above Theron's excavation and called it a grave. The man who had brought his sons to watch as a cautionary tale. The man who had told Deacon Hollis after church that come spring, they would be digging the Birch family out of their hole frozen solid and burying them properly in the ground they were so eager to live under. That man was lying on his side in the snow, curled like a child covered in frost and ice, his clothing stiff and white, his face gray, his breathing so shallow that Theron had to put his cheek near Josiah's mouth to confirm that breathing was happening at all. But he was alive. Theron got his arms under Josiah and lifted. The man was heavy and unresponsive, his body rigid with cold, his limbs locked in the position they had frozen into. Theron half carried, half dragged him back toward the earth shelter, struggling through the deep snow, his boots filling with white powder, his arms burning with the effort of supporting a man who weighed at least 50 pounds more than he did. He got Josiah through the door and laid him on the floor near the fireplace. Margaret was already moving, bringing blankets, pushing the children back to give the man space. Silas and Nettie stared with wide eyes at the frost-covered figure who had appeared from the white world outside, a man they recognized as the neighbor who had always looked at their home with contempt and their father with pity. Theron removed Josiah's frozen outer layers, carefully working the stiff clothing away from skin that was gray and cold. The man's hands were white and waxy, the fingers swollen, the skin showing the unmistakable signs of severe frostbite. His feet were the same. His face had patches of white on the cheeks and nose where the tissue had frozen. But nothing was black. Nothing had died beyond recovery. There was hope if warming was done correctly. Margaret brought warm water and cloths. They wrapped Josiah's hands and feet gently, not rubbing, not pressing, just enclosing them in warmth and letting the heat penetrate gradually. Rubbing frostbitten tissue would damage it further. Theron knew this from experience, from watching what happened to men in Cincinnati who worked in cold warehouses and tried to warm their hands too fast. Over the next hour, Josiah slowly returned to consciousness. His eyes opened and closed several times without focus. He murmured words that were not words, sounds that might have been names or prayers, or simply the noise a body makes when it is climbing back from the edge of death. His fingers began to move, first the thumbs, then the others, flexing weakly inside the warm wrappings. When awareness finally settled behind his eyes and he recognized where he was, the expression on Josiah Trask's face was something Theron would remember for the rest of his life. It was not gratitude, not yet. Gratitude would come later, after the shock faded and the implications became clear. What Theron saw in that first moment of recognition was understanding. The same understanding that had come to Theron himself 2 years earlier, watching Silas burn with fever in a cabin that could not keep him warm. The understanding that what everyone believed, what everyone practiced, what everyone trusted could be wrong, could be fatally wrong, and that admitting this was not weakness, but the beginning of wisdom. Josiah's lips moved. His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "My family," he said. "We will get to them," Theron replied. "When you are strong enough, we will get to them." Josiah closed his eyes. A tear tracked down his gray cheek and froze before it reached his jaw. It took 2 days before Josiah could stand and another day before he could walk. During that time, Theron made the trip to the Trask cabin with firewood strapped to a makeshift sled, pulling it through snow that was still thigh-deep across the open prairie. He found the cabin buried to its eaves, the door blocked by a drift 10 feet high. He dug through and found the family inside, cold and frightened but alive. They had burned the last of the cabin's interior furnishings the night before. Another 12 hours without fuel would have killed them. He brought them wood and food and the news that Josiah was alive and recovering. He made the same trip to Deacon Hollis, finding a similar situation. The Deacon's family had survived by burning everything they could break apart, and they were now huddled in a stripped cabin with nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the log walls around them. Theron brought them wood too. He had wood to spare. His careful stockpile, calculated for a heating demand that was a fraction of what conventional cabins required, had barely been touched by the storm. He had months of fuel remaining while his neighbors had nothing. Josiah Trask spent 6 weeks in the earth shelter, sharing the 16 by 20-foot space with a family he had openly mocked for months. His frostbite healed slowly. He lost the tips of 3 fingers on his left hand and 2 toes on his right foot. The losses were permanent reminders of what the blizzard had cost him and what the earth shelter had saved. During those 6 weeks, Josiah asked Theron hundreds of questions: how deep to dig, how to angle the walls, how to build the curved roof framework, how to layer the roof covering, how to construct a chimney that would draw properly in an enclosed underground space, how to calculate materials, how to plan drainage, how to seal against water while maintaining ventilation. Theron answered every question with patience and detail. He drew diagrams on the packed earth floor. He took Josiah outside when the weather permitted and showed him the construction from the exterior, pointing out features that were invisible from inside. He explained the principles behind every decision, not just what to do, but why it worked, so that Josiah would understand the logic and be able to adapt when conditions at his own site differed from Theron's. He did this without resentment, without reminding Josiah of the things he had said, without pointing out the irony of a man who had predicted frozen corpses now learning the methods that had saved his life. Theron understood that pride had nearly killed Josiah and that the humility earned through suffering deserved respect, not retribution. The knowledge was too important to withhold for the sake of proving a point. Spring of 1873 arrived late. Snow lingered into April. The ground remained frozen well into May. But when the thaw finally came, it brought with it a change that went deeper than the melting of snow and the softening of earth. The blizzard had killed 11 people across the region. It had destroyed or severely damaged dozens of cabins. It had depleted wood supplies to the point where families had burned furniture, tools, wagon parts, and anything else combustible to stay alive. Those who survived did so through luck, desperate improvisation, or by receiving help from neighbors whose preparations had proven superior. Barnabas Trask began construction of his own earth-sheltered dwelling as soon as the ground was workable. He chose a site near his ruined cabin, a gentle south-facing slope that reminded him of what he had studied during 6 weeks of recovery. He followed the methods Theron had taught him, excavating carefully, building drainage systems, constructing the double-layer walls and curved roof framework that were essential to the design. The work took most of the summer. His two sons helped boys who had once stood at the edge of Theron's excavation and listened to their father call it a monument to stubbornness. They worked without complaint. They had spent a winter in a cabin that nearly killed them and 6 weeks in an earth shelter that kept them alive. They did not need to be told which was better. Ephraim Greer began his earth shelter in June. His cabin roof had partially collapsed during the blizzard, the ridgepole bending under snow loads. It was never designed to bear. He had no desire to rebuild using methods that had failed. He worked alongside Theron for 2 weeks, learning the techniques, absorbing the principles, asking the questions of a man who had always been open to better ideas. When he continued on his own, he incorporated innovations that Theron had not considered. A small root cellar dug beneath the main floor for food storage, where the slightly cooler temperature below the living space would keep vegetables and preserves through the summer. A secondary ventilation shaft on the opposite side of the dwelling from the chimney, improving air circulation and reducing the slight stuffiness that was the only legitimate complaint about earth-sheltered living. The modifications worked well. Theron visited Ephraim's completed shelter and examined the innovations with genuine interest. He incorporated the root cellar design into his recommendations for others and acknowledged that the secondary ventilation shaft was an improvement he wished he had thought of himself. Deacon Hollis, whose family had come within hours of freezing to death, became an advocate for earth-sheltered construction. He used his position of respect within the community to encourage families to consider the method, speaking about it after church services, mentioning it in conversations with new settlers, lending his moral authority to an approach that had saved lives when conventional wisdom had failed. In September of 1873, Deacon Hollis organized a gathering at Ephraim Greer's homestead, where Theron explained the principles of earth-sheltered construction to 30 families who had assembled from across the territory. He stood before them, still lean and weathered, still carrying the calluses and scars of his construction work, and he described what he had built and why it worked. He drew diagrams. He answered questions. He shared everything he knew without reservation because the knowledge was not his to keep. It had come to him from Gunner Folk, who had carried it from the old country, and it belonged to anyone who needed it. By autumn, 7 earth-sheltered dwellings were under construction or completed within 20 miles of the Birch homestead. Each family adapted the basic principles to their own situations. Some built larger structures. Others added multiple rooms. Some incorporated more window space along the exposed front walls. Others prioritized storage or livestock shelter. But all followed the fundamental approach. Dig into the earth, build strong frameworks, cover with multiple insulating layers. Create spaces that worked with the ground's natural temperature rather than fighting against the extreme air temperatures of the northern plains. Theron Birch lived in his earth shelter for 18 years. He improved it over time, adding a second room in 1876 when the children needed their own sleeping space. He installed a larger window in 1879, a real glass pane purchased from a supply house in Sioux Falls, and the light it brought into the dwelling made Margaret smile in a way that he had not seen since Wisconsin. He built a small attached workshop in 1882, connected to the main dwelling by a short passage, giving himself a space for the furniture making he had never entirely abandoned. The structure never failed him. It remained warm in winter, cool in summer, dry during the spring rains that turned the prairie into mud and stable through every storm that crossed the Dakota Territory in nearly 2 decades. The curved roof held its shape. The drainage systems channeled water away. The walls maintained their seal. The chimney drew clean and true year after year. His children grew up in that space, learned their lessons by firelight, and window light played on the sleeping platform, in the earthen floor, and carried with them into adulthood the knowledge that the most important things are not always the most visible ones. Silas moved to Minnesota in 1885, finding work in a lumber mill where his understanding of wood and construction served him well. Nettie married a farmer from Iowa in 1887, a steady man who built her a proper frame house with large windows because he understood, without being told, that light mattered to her in ways that went beyond simple preference. Margaret died in 1889 from pneumonia. It was a winter illness, the kind that could strike anyone regardless of how warm their home was, and it took her in 12 days despite everything Theron did to fight it. He held her hand in the earth shelter as she faded, the fire burning low, the walls holding their steady warmth, the space she had learned to love after learning to fear it becoming the last place she would know. Theron stayed on alone for a year after Margaret's death. The homestead felt empty without her in ways that the earth could not fill. The shelter was still warm, still dry, still everything he had built it to be. But warmth without someone to share it is just temperature, and a home without the person who made it home is just a structure. In 1890, at age 49, he sold his land to a young couple newly arrived from Illinois, eager and optimistic, the way all new settlers were, the way Theron and Margaret had been 19 years earlier. The young man looked at the earth shelter with curiosity and some confusion, unsure what to make of a home that was mostly underground. Theron spent an afternoon explaining the construction and maintenance, showing the new owner how to check the drainage, how to inspect the roof layers, how to manage the chimney. The young man listened politely and asked sensible questions, and would end up living in the earth shelter for another 30 years before building a frame house nearby and converting the underground dwelling to storage. Theron moved to Iowa to live with Nettie and her family. He was a quiet presence in their household, a grandfather who carved wooden animals for children who had never seen the Dakota prairie, and who slept easily in rooms with large windows and abundant light. He did not talk much about his years on the frontier. He did not tell stories about the blizzard or the earth shelter or the neighbors who had called him mad. When asked about his past, he gave simple answers that satisfied curiosity without revealing depth. He died in 1897 at the age of 56, quietly in his daughter's home, surrounded by grandchildren who knew him only as a gentleman with scarred hands who could make a wooden horse so lifelike that it seemed ready to gallop off the table. His obituary in the local newspaper was 3 lines long. It mentioned his name and his age and the fact that he had once homesteaded in the Dakota Territory. It said nothing about the earth shelter, nothing about the blizzard, nothing about the lives his knowledge had saved or the building methods he had pioneered and shared. But in the earth itself, his legacy endured. By 1900, more than 40 earth-sheltered dwellings existed across the Dakota Territory, with variations of the design spreading into Montana, Minnesota, and Nebraska. Settlers learned from each other, improved techniques, and passed knowledge forward in the way that practical wisdom has always traveled from one person to the next, hand to hand, voice to voice. The principles that Gunnar Falk had shared with Theron beside a fire on an April evening, principles that were ancient when America was young, became part of the frontier survival knowledge that allowed communities to persist in a climate that punished ignorance and rewarded adaptation. Most of these structures were eventually abandoned. Frame construction became standard as railroads brought lumber to the plains. Coal and later oil made heating large above-ground houses economically practical. The earth shelters fell into disuse, their entrances collapsing their roofs, settling their carefully engineered interiors, filling with dirt and debris as the prairie slowly reclaimed what had been carved from it. But they did not disappear entirely. Archaeological surveys in the northern plains occasionally discover the remains of these dwellings. Circular or oval depressions in hillsides with stone foundations, still visible beneath accumulated soil, and evidence of drainage systems that functioned for decades. The researchers who find them sometimes note the sophistication of the construction, the careful engineering that went into structures built by people with nothing but hand tools and hard-won knowledge. They do not always know who built them. The names are lost mostly the way names are always lost when the people who carried them pass beyond living memory. But the evidence remains in the earth's silent testimony to men and women who understood something that their neighbors did not. That survival sometimes requires humility. That innovation sometimes looks like madness. That the wisdom of the crowd is not always wise. And that building down into the ground, into the dark, into the place where the earth holds its constant warmth against the killing, cold above can be the most courageous act of building up. The blizzard of 1873 remained in regional memory for generations, referenced as the worst winter in Dakota history until the storms of 1888 exceeded it. Those who survived told stories to children and grandchildren about the cold that stopped clocks, and the wind that moved barns, and the snow that buried the world so deep that spring seemed like a rumor from a foreign country. Among those stories passed from one generation to the next in kitchens and parlors and around fires that burned in fireplaces built above ground were accounts of a family who weathered the storm in an unusual home, an earth-covered dwelling that performed impossibly well when every conventional structure failed. A home built by a man that his neighbors called foolish until the blizzard proved he was the wisest among them. The name faded from these stories over time, as names always do. But the story itself persisted because it carried a truth that people recognized even when they could not name it. The truth that the man who digs when others laugh, who builds what others mock, who trusts his own calculations, when the world trusts tradition, is sometimes the man who saves not only his family but his neighbors, and leaves behind something more lasting than a name. He leaves behind the knowledge that the earth, which was here before any of us and will be here after all of us are gone, has always known how to keep its children warm.